An alternative pretty cool method of extracting the window frame involves transparency and displacement. Intriguing, hmm? So let's start all over again by enabling the high poly mesh visibility, vertex colors. What I'm going to do next is summon our plane companion, which is so great for redrawing the topology. Orient it according to the normal of the wall, roughly. Something like that. Maybe push it out a little bit. The X-ray mode can be toggled on to ease the process of redrawing the retopo. And in the edit mode, I'm grabbing the edge and pressing GG to slide it, C to go beyond the original frame. Press G twice to slide. Something like that. The plan is to capture the surface area around the window, so we can play with masking it out and turning it into a separate object. Alright, Ctrl R to draw the extra edge loops. Ideally, if they follow the contours of the window like that. Technically, we could have used just the plane and bake everything onto it and resort to displacement for pressing the geometry inwards. Still, I think it will work somewhat better if we extrude the window frame manually like this. Displacement is not a silver bullet, and it can get really distorted if you push it way too far. Alright, with the future tessellation and displacement in mind, I'm dividing the mesh into quads basically, by slicing it up using the Ctrl R to add the edge loops. Then deleting the set of faces in the center, and I think the geometry is now ready to go. But first, in the edit mode, select all polygons, U for unwrapping, choose Smart UV Project, and after doing that, I usually try to guess what would be the correct orientation of the UV map. It's a tricky thing to do, especially if you're as lazy as me, and you don't dare to use any specific guides. Anyway, let's pack the UV islands, and then crank up the margin in the settings. It's fairly important to have the padding or the margin between the UV islands. It will definitely allow you to avoid some issues during baking. Okay, now that should be it for the preparation. Aside from maybe averaging the normals by smoothing the shading out. Right-click, shade smooth. Averaging normals is important for baking, otherwise the displacement will make the object self-intersect in some cases. And now the normal map should be baked, as well as displacement map. Whoop. So I fast-tracked the baking process, and now I'm setting up the shader using the newly baked textures. We should be fairly familiar with this process by now. It consists of setting up the diffuse and normal maps, and then as a shortcut for the roughness map, we just plug the diffuse texture into color ramp, invert the flags like this, and then make sure that the overall brightness is pretty high, so the material is pretty rough. And now comes one of the key parts for these particular assets, namely the displacement map. It's the linear displacement map with raw or absolute values baked in XNormal. It should be plugged into the height of the displacement node and then into the displacement input. To be able to play with the micropolygon tessellation and displacement, we need to switch over to cycles and into the experimental feature set. Then it's a matter of adding the subdivision surface modifier with the adaptive subdivision turned on. The mode should be set to simple. And then, we have some problems after trying to render it out in the viewport. Some of it can be solved within the UV editor, I believe. It's a very common issue that accidentally some weird portions of the photoscan data get baked. It is especially evident with the displacement texture, so by sliding the UV map ever so slightly, we push the UV islands away from these problematic regions. You can see that there are some bright streaks in the baked displacement map. That's what we're talking about here. So I'm selecting yet another UV island, trying to guess where the spikes are coming from. From this area, I think. We need to apply this tweak to all the surfaces that were close enough to the inner portion of the window, because there were a problematic juncture where two types of surfaces met, And obviously it all got baked into the displacement. Classic. So that's the last bit, I believe. Where it is. Very cool. It looks to me like we have fixed it successfully just by sliding UVs. Very nice method. As a quick reminder, the mid-level should be set to 0 within the displacement node and the scale to 1 if you baked the linear values or the absolute values. As for the dicing scale within the subdivision modifier, the lower you go, the more detailed it will be. And obviously the more memory it will take as a result. From the first time I saw the micropolygon displacement up to this day, I think it looks truly impressive. It's such a good step towards the infinite tessellation, or how should I put it? A sub-pixel massive detalization. I don't know, you name it. Alright, to take it to the next level in terms of realism and in terms of interoperability and how it can be used with other assets, I will play with the transparency or the alpha map. New texture. The alpha should be checked off. The texture itself will be used as the alpha map. It doesn't need to have its own alpha, if it makes sense. The color should be set to white to begin with, meaning the maximum opacity. And it should go into the alpha socket of the material. And nothing happened really, because the opacity is set to its maximum. To paint the opacity by hand, let's go down into the texture paint mode. The settings for the brushes can be found at the top of the user interface or in this menu. Let's make sure we selected alpha as our texture. Let's paint with black, meaning full transparency, as opposed to full opacity. The fall off is pretty smooth right now. I have nothing against it really. But we need to tweak a few things in order to see the effect in the viewport. First, let's get back to Eevee. Click the rendered mode. Navigate to the material settings. And change the blend mode to alpha hashed. And the shadow mode to alpha hashed as well. Now we can paint with transparency basically, and that's very cool, I think. What if we could create a nice transition based on the brick structure? Let's give it a shot. I'm pretty confident it will look fairly believable, especially when coupled with displacement. Maybe not as believable as the geometric variation, but it will have its own benefits. Like the setup based on textures is fairly easy to tweak. You can redraw the alpha map at any point. So what I'm doing here is following the contours of the bricks to create the illusion that we have extracted some interesting portion of the wall, and hopefully that will make it much easier to integrate this asset into the existing environment, especially if the environment is also made of bricks. That would be perfect. X is the shortcut to flip the colors if you want to take away the transparency. Hopefully you will find this process enjoyable enough to spend some 15 minutes on painting the alpha map. It will be totally worth it in the end. And here it is, our alpha mapped version of the window frame. Let's just make sure we saved the alpha map in the image editor. I'm finding the texture, then just saving it as a TIFF file. The format doesn't matter at this point, to be honest. Any uncompressed format will do. Now I'm gonna visit the shader editor to see what we have done. Remember we used the smoother fall-off for the transparency brush? Actually, the fall-off can be fine-tuned in post. Like with the use of the color ramp or the map range nodes. By adjusting the first two sliders, which say from minimum and from maximum, we basically adjust the contrast of the mask. Or how should I put it? The feathering of the edges, rather. It would be a more accurate representation of what's going on. But you know what? I also liked the original smoother transition. I think it will help to integrate it better into environment. In my opinion, it looks fairly believable even without the displacement. Remember, we have displacement on this mesh. I'm curious to see how it all would work together. Boom. Wow. Don't tell me we combined a couple of fake techniques, because that's exactly what we did. It is still a very intriguing set of fake techniques. And a fairly believable combination as well.